Welcome to English Grammar Session 4. Today's topic is the third and final installment of the verb phrase, and we're looking at mood, modality and voice. First of all, mood is one of the two verbal categories that are to do with factuality, and in English we have three subcategories. First we have the indicative, which is the fact mood, and this presents situations as facts. We also have the subjunctive mood. We can also call that the thought mood or what if mood, and basically this presents situations as either non-facts or hypotheses. Finally, we also have the imperative mood. We can call this the will mood if you like, and this expresses non-factual situations that are desired by a speaker or writer to become true. So we basically, as speakers or writers, we want hearers or readers to do something for us, right? Now, the indicative mood specifies that the speaker or writer considers the situation expressed by the verb phrase to be factual or conceivably real in some way, and it's basically the standard way, the unmarked way of using the present and past tense in English. And here we have three examples. So these are not the droids you're looking for. We can see here that we have these are, this is just a simple present tense, and then you're looking for. So here we have the progressive aspect, but they're both in the indicative mood. We also have the subjunctive mood, and the subjunctive expresses situations that are hypothetical or otherwise non-factual. So in modern English, this is primarily done through modality, actually. So by using modal verbs or semi-modal verbs, as well as what's called the modal past and the modal past perfect. And the subjunctive is not used that often, yet it's still used often enough for it to be considered an important verbal category, and this is why you need to know about it. So apart from the were subjunctive, which you might be familiar with, the subjunctive is identical to the verbal base form. So the form of the verb that we use in the subjunctive mood is the verbal base form, and we have three types of subjunctive mood. We have the formulaic subjunctive, we have the mandative subjunctive, and finally the were subjunctive. And let's look at them in more detail. Now, the formulaic subjunctive is typically used in formulas, basically. So fixed expressions often expressing wishes. Now, if these are positive wishes, we can call them optatives, but if they're negative wishes or curses, we call them maledictives. And here we have two examples. So in God Save the Queen, this save is in the subjunctive mood. And we can see that God Save the Queen, it is a formula, it's a fixed expression. So this is the formulaic subjunctive. And you notice that the verbs here, save and take, are in the base form. Okay, so we don't have any inflections on it at all. Now, the mandative subjunctive expresses some sort of obligation or an order or an intention, and it typically appears after nouns, verbs and adjectives that somehow express either requests, orders or compulsions. This is quite rarely used in British English actually, but it seems to be extensively used in American English still, so it's worth knowing about it. And here we have some examples. So if I say I demand that he be executed, we're looking at the verb be. So we can see it's in the base form, all right? So to be, right? The same form that we use for the infinitive. And we can see that this he be executed follows the verb demand. And this verb demand, it expresses an order. Yeah, and this is why we need the mandative subjunctive following it. Finally, we have the were subjunctive. Now, this expresses a situation that's hypothetical. It could be a wish. And basically, we use the form were across the board, even for first and third person singular objects, where normally the verb to be obviously looks different, right? So in A here, we can see it's if I were you. Normally, you would say I was going somewhere, right? But here we can see that we use this form were both for the first person singular, but also for the third person singular in example B with Justin Bieber. Now, the imperative, this is a different kind of mood, and this mood is used to indicate that the situation expressed is desired to such a degree that the speaker or writer feels that he or she can order other people to make it happen, basically. So this is also the mood that we use for basically making orders. So morphologically, the imperative is also identical to the base form. So here we have 3 examples. So we can see that it looks just like the infinitive. So these are examples of what we call directive imperatives. Now, you should note that the use of the imperative mood presupposes an unequal power relation between the person speaking and the person listening, because the speaker is required to have some sort of authority over the hearer in order to be able to give out orders, right? To use the imperative. So in addition to giving orders, we can use the imperatives for other things, but these are all sanctioned by this unequal power relation. So here we have some examples. We obviously have commands, but we can also see in D that we can give advice, but we still use the imperative. And D here is a little bit special. This is an example of expert power. So this is because the person giving out the advice is an expert in the area, right? So that means that they then have some sort of authority over the customer in this case, right? But we can see that we can use the imperatives also for instructions and permissions and even in prayers. So the imperative may also be used in other situations where this directive function, which is basically telling people what to do, where this function is less apparent or maybe not even applicable at all. So here we can see in insults, for instance, even in wishes, in exclamations. So the forms of the verbs are all the imperative, right? So the mood here are imperatives, but we are not actually using the imperative to give an order to anybody. Now, modality is the other category that adds perspectives of factuality to the situation, right? So more specifically, it expresses the speaker's conception of likelihood or obligation regarding the reality or unreality of the situation that you're talking about. So we have 2 types of modality in English, and the book calls this likelihood and obligation, but more commonly, these are referred to as epistemic modality and deontic modality. And modality is primarily expressed by modal verbs, and these are listed in A here. We also have some verbs that we can call semi-modal verbs, or they're sort of verbal constructions, but we're going to be focusing on the primary modal verbs, all right? So the others are not recognized as modal verbs as such, and they behave in a different way. So we're just focusing on the ones in A here. Now, one thing to remember is that likelihood is epistemic modality and obligation is deontic modality. So both of these types of modality are of a scalar nature. This means that it's like a scale, right? It's on a scale from 1 to 10. Or, well, they don't really have numbers, but imagine a scale, right? That goes from 0 to 10 or something like that. So obviously, the modal verbs then can express a degree of either epistemic or deontic modality. So we can say that we talk about a scale of likelihood and a scale of obligation, or a scale of this epistemic modality or of deontic modality. So they can either be weak or strong, basically, right? So depending on where they are on this scale. Now, there is a problem, however, with the terms likelihood and obligation. And the problem with likelihood is that this type of modality also includes what we sometimes call logical necessity, which doesn't really have anything to do with likelihood, and also ability, right? We also sometimes include that under this type of modality, but again, it doesn't have anything to do with likelihood. So if we just look at example A here, if ninjas can do all those things they do, then they must know magic. So can in this instance obviously denotes their ability to be able to do something, right? Not the likelihood of them doing it, but their actual physical ability. And in the second part, they must know magic. It's a logical necessity, okay? We are deducing this based on the first part of the sentence. So again, it's not the likelihood of them knowing magic, yeah? But rather we're talking about logical necessity. The problem with obligation is that this type of modality also covers other things. For instance, volition. So this has to do with your free will, basically. So if you choose to do something out of your free will, we also, that would sort of fall under what here in the book is called obligation. But obviously it doesn't really have anything to do with obligation if you think of the meaning, right? So if you say, I will rise, it's not because you're obligated to do so, it's because you choose to do so, right? It's based on your free will. Other things, such as permission, is sometimes discussed as a kind of modality. Also these optatives and maledictives, if you remember those, right? Types of wishes, again, they can actually be expressed using modal verbs. And again, they don't really have anything to do with likelihood, for instance. So because of this, it's all a bit confusing, I know. That's also why we suggest that you use the terms epistemic and deontic instead of likelihood and obligation, because they are void. Okay, so that means that they do not have these connotations that the English words themselves, likelihood and obligation, that they have. Yeah, and also because they're basically more widely used. So if you want to go on, you want to read more about modal verbs, they're going to be described in terms of epistemic and deontic modality. Now, let's look at the semantics of the primary modal verbs. So basically, what do they mean? Now, I'm going to go through all of them, so you're going to get a bit of an overview of the semantics, right? And we'll focus only on the present or future modal uses. But obviously, you should keep in mind that the past tense forms of the modal verbs also may refer to possibilities and obligations in the past. So can, right, can be used to talk about, for instance, a theoretical possibility, permissions, and ability. Could, that's often sort of perceived as the past tense form of can, right? But it is often also used in its own right. So we can actually use could to talk about things in the present or future if it is of weak possibility. And we often also use it to be polite. May, we can use to describe factual possibility, permission, or wishes. So here we have the optatives and maledictives that we also looked at earlier. Now you may just want to pause the video here and just have a look at this and read the examples. Might is also the past tense form of may. But again, we also use this in its own right to talk about, for instance, hypothetical possibility and also to express politeness. Must is quite a strong modal verb here, right, which is often used to indicate obligation or compulsion. And also this logical necessity that we talked about earlier. And finally, shall. So again, shall, we can use this to talk about the future in a neutral way. We can also use it to make suggestions or promises or talk about obligations. And again, you may want to pause the video here and read these examples in more detail. Now, we also have should, which expresses, again, a very weak obligation. We can use it to talk about probability, intention, and so on. And again, should is linked with shall, in that should expresses the past tense of shall, but we can also use it on its own to actually talk about things in the present tense. We also have will, and we can see that we can use will for quite a lot. We can obviously use it to talk about the future, actually with no modality. We can use it to talk about different types of prediction or volition again. So remember, this is when we talk about your free will, and also about ability or capacity. Finally, would. So again, would is also the past tense form of will, but you can also use it in its own right to talk about sort of hypothetical and very weak possibilities, or if you want to be polite. So again, you may want to just pause the video here to have a proper read of these different examples. Now for voice. So it can be quite difficult to find an actual definition of the concept of voice in your grammar book, for instance, where they just state that it covers the distinction between passive verb phrases and active verb phrases. And this is true, but it's not really a definition. So here is a better definition. So voice is a category used in grammatical description, chiefly with reference to the verb, to express the way a clause may alter the relationship between subject and object without changing the meaning of the sentence. And that is basically what voice is all about. So voice in English covers two categories. We have the active voice and the passive voice. So let's just look at these two categories in more detail and look at their formal or structural properties. So voice categories are distinguished on the basis of the verb phrase structure as well as the structure of constituent order. So here we have active voice constructions, and in active voice constructions we have subject, verb, object, word order. So this is also the unmarked form. So this is basically where the voice in which most language takes place. We have subject, verb, object, order, which you should be familiar with. Here we have two examples. The first is with a monotransitive verb, the ninja killed the samurai. And the second one is with the ditransitive verb, the master gave his apprentice a ninja sword. Now, depending on the transitivity of the verb, the passive voice constructions are going to look slightly different. But basically, the passive voice construction, as you might remember from our session on aspect, consists of a subject first, then the verb, and the verb phrase then consists of auxiliary be plus the past participle of the main verb, and then we also have an optional adverbial at the end. So you can see we have an A there in brackets. Now we can also use get rather than be to form a passive, but here we're just going to focus on sort of the most standard passive, if you will, which is formed by be, but you can also use get, although this is more informal. Here we have some examples. So the first one, A, is the same sentence as A above, and we have the monotransitive construction here. So if you want to passivize the ninja killed the samurai, it becomes the samurai was killed, and then we have in brackets here by the ninja. So this in brackets is optional. You could just say the samurai was killed. We can see that for the second one with the ditransitive verb, we actually have two different versions of the passive. Either we can say the apprentice was given a ninja sword by the master, or a ninja sword was given to the apprentice by the master. And we're going to look at this in more detail, but just so you can see that for ditransitive constructions where we have two objects basically in the active, we have two different ways of passivizing this. So what happens is that you turn the object in the active sentence into a subject, and then you turn the subject in the active sentence into an adverbial headed by, or you leave it out altogether. And we can see this on the figure. So at the top we have the active sentence, the ninja killed the samurai, and at the bottom we have the passive voice construction, the samurai was killed. And we can see that in the active voice sentence or clause, the samurai is a direct object. This is made the subject of the passive. We keep the verb, obviously, but we change the aspect, right? So we basically have the auxiliary be in this case in the past tense, because killed in the original sentence is past tense, and then we have killed in the past participle, and then the original subject, the ninja, becomes this optional adverbial at the end, yeah, which you can sort of leave in or you can leave it out. And obviously there are different reasons for doing both, and we're going to get to that as well. So in ditransitive constructions, you have more options. So remember, here in ditransitive constructions, we have two objects. We have both the indirect object and the direct object. And you can see this in the top. Okay, so again, the top sentence is the active voice sentence. The master gave his apprentice a ninja sword. So in the first example, we have taken the indirect object, which is his apprentice, the subject, right? Again, we keep the verb, and then the ninja sword, which was the direct object in the active voice sentence, it remains the direct object in the passive voice. And then we have finally by the master. So here we have the original subject, the master, which we put into this optional category. So that's one way of doing it. However, because we have two objects in the active, so instead of then taking the indirect object and making that the subject, we can also take the direct object. So that's the ninja sword. Yeah, we can also make that the subject of the passive voice construction. So that becomes a ninja sword was given to the apprentice. So obviously we then need to make an adverbial, right, out of the indirect object. So to the apprentice, and still we have the original subject, the master, as an optional adverbial. Now, sometimes we have different types of sentences. For instance, ones where we have a prepositional complement. So here, someone has slept in my bed. So someone has slept. That's and then in my bed, right? If we wanted to passivize that, what we then make the subject of the passive voice construction is going to be my bed. So my bed has been slept in, and then we have this someone who sort of just put in the bin, right? So my bed has been slept in. We could say by someone, right? But we could also leave it out. Now, obviously, this is a different type of construction. We can even say that to sleep in a bed, to sleep in is even a phrasal verb. So we can see that it looks slightly different. But the thing to bear in mind here is that this subject in the active voice construction, right? So in the original sentence, as it were, is basically left out. Now, other types of transitivity constructions, so complex transitive constructions of different forms, they have specific passivization processes associated with them. But here we're just going to focus on the monotransitive and the ditransitive ones. So voice basically allows you to change the relationship between the subject and object without changing the actual meaning. All right, so the meaning is the same. It still describes the same situation. Now, in order to understand how that's possible, we have to understand that the participant roles and the participant role structures inside the sentences. So the main purpose of passivization is that of agent demotion. Okay, so when you demote somebody, or an agent in this case, all right, you put them sort of to the back of the queue, as it were. Right? So this means that you move the agent away from the subject position and you move it out of what is called the topic position. Okay, and I have a figure that I'm going to show you in just a minute that shows you this. So it means that the agent is assigned less informational prominence. It's no longer the most important thing in the sentence. All right, so here we can see that we have the ninja killed the samurai sentence. So on your left you can see it in the active, and on your right we have it in the passive. And on the left hand side we can see that the subject is the ninja. It's also the agent. Okay, so it's the person carrying out the action described by the verb, and it's also in the topic position. So the topic here is the first position. And we can see that the samurai is the patient, right? So basically they're the direct object. So they are basically what whatever the process is sort of affecting. Yeah, so they are affected by the killing. So when we create the passive voice construction on your right, you can see that the samurai becomes obviously the samurai, which was the object, is now the subject, but it is still the patient. Yeah, so if you say the samurai was killed, it's still the patient. Yeah, it's still the person or the entity affected by the process described by the verb. We can also see that the ninja is still the agent, but it might actually be left out completely because it's in brackets, right? It's actually optional. We can leave it out. We can also see that in the passive voice construction on your right, the samurai is now in the first position. That means that it's now in the topic position. So it's given more prominence in that way, right? It's sort of promoted, if you wish. So passives that retain the agent are called long passives, and those passives where you just leave it out are called short passives. So here we have some more examples. So the first one, A, is an active sentence. American troops arrested Saddam Hussein. In B, we have a long passive. So you would say Saddam Hussein was arrested by American troops, because we can see who the agent is, right? We still have the American troops there. But in C, we have a short passive. We just say Saddam Hussein was arrested, so we don't actually know who arrested him. Now finally, let's look at the difference between the short and long passive and when you use one and when you use the other. Basically, people use the short passive because they do not want to mention the agent. So your book lists the following properties of the agent that may prompt the use of the short passive. So maybe the agent is unknown, so you simply cannot mention it. Maybe the agent is unimportant or irrelevant. Or maybe it's just really obvious and you don't want to be stating the obvious. So these can all be different reasons for choosing the short passive. However, even if the agent is indeed important or relevant, you can also use the short passive to present things as if the agent were irrelevant, or even to actually hide the agent, right? So if you use it in this way, this partially falls under the diplomacy or vagueness function that's also mentioned in your book. So in A, here we have an active sentence. American troops accidentally shot down a British helicopter. Now, obviously, this is not great, and you may, for diplomatic reasons, want to be a little bit vague, which may prompt you to use the short passive and then say a British helicopter was accidentally shot down. And you simply leave out who did it, okay? You leave out the agent, so there might be different reasons for choosing to do so. Now, the long passive, again, there are different reasons for choosing the long passive construction, and your book, they focus on these reasons that have to do with the structure of information in the sentence. And one reason is the end focus and thematization reason. So if the patient of the clause in question represents known or given information and the agent represents new information, well, then in accordance with what we call the end focus principles and thematization principles, the patient should be promoted to subject. And that's because we like given information to come before new information in a sentence. So just in general, right? That's basically what these principles state. So this means that we can present the patient, which is known to us, first, and then we can introduce this agent in this by adverbial phrase, right, at the end. So remember, it's a long passive, so we include it. So here we have an example. So first we have a group of civilians peacefully demonstrated in the streets. So this is just the background, right? This is the setup. The second one is then the civilians were mowed down by machine gun fire. So this is your passive voice construction, right? So the civilians we know because we just mentioned them in the sentence before. But this machine gun fire business, right? That's the agent. The machine gun is the agent. And that's new. We don't know about them, right? They hadn't been mentioned before. So if we want to go with this end focus and thematization principles, we have to introduce the known information, so the civilians, before we introduce the new information, the machine gun. Yeah? So that's the reason for that. Now, there can also be a different reason for choosing the long passive. We also have a principle called the end weight principle. And basically, this applies if the constituent representing the agent, so again, this is what would normally be the subject, if that constituent is really complex and long, we also call this heavy, then basically we have to put it to the end because we like all of these big and heavy and chunky constituents to occur at the end, right? That's why it's called end weight. So we want all of these heavyweight constituents to occur at the end. And in the passive voice construction, that allows us to do that, and we can put it in this by adverbial phrase. So let's look at A here. The civilians were shot by, right, and then you have it, the agent. The heavily armed police officers who later claimed to have misunderstood their orders only to fire if necessary. Right, this is a very, very long and huge and very heavy constituent. So this is why a passive seems like the good choice. In B, you can see what it looks like in the active voice. So in the active voice, this huge constituent, because it's the agent, obviously that's the subject in the active voice, right? That has to come first. Then the sentence becomes, heavily armed police officers who later claimed to have misunderstood their orders only to fire if necessary shot the civilians. And because we have this very, very chunky subject which has other clauses inside, that we try to establish some sort of link between the subject and the verb, right? And then the direct object, but we have to wait for a very long time until we're sort of finished with that subject before we get to the verb. It's really the heavily armed police officers who shot the civilians, but we have to wade through all of these other clauses before we get to the business, right? Before we get to the verb. And it can just mean that sentences like these are really, really difficult to understand. So this would be another instance where choosing a long passive would be a good thing to do. You want to help the reader, basically.